In this edition of If Explains, listen to Insight Forward CEO Ross Hill and Chief Geopolitical Officer Dr. Treston Wheat discuss great power politics, US-China decoupling, and deglobalization.
We're going to move on now and talk about some of the actual risks that we are highlighting in this year's report. And I think one of the themes we looked at when we created the report was actually, how interconnected all of those risks are. Starting with the main one, which we're calling out, which is great power politics. And we've written about this quite a lot over the last year or so anyway, and talked about it a lot. And we sort of, when we started doing that, we thought about it as like the revenge of geopolitics, we called it, because it felt like we'd sort of shifted from maybe what felt like lots of things around international security issues. We might have used that terminology rather than geopolitics, or just pure kind of security issues rather than those kind of overarching big issues. So, why do we now think about it as the revenge of geopolitics?
So, as we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, multinational corporations arose really in the world of neoliberalism. And a critical aspect of neoliberalism was globalization and interconnectedness. And so we believed in this almost teleological Francis Fukuyama kind of paradigm where the world was getting closer together. We were integrating markets, and it was for a while. But then the revenge of geopolitics was and is these long-term historical forces came back from underneath. There was only a veneer of market integration. Nationalism, religion, historical grievances. This was all underneath the whole time. And by ignoring it or being unaware that it existed, we saw this stuff rise back up. And the traditional forms of geopolitics are essentially returning because of these long-term historical trends and grievances. But then also, not just that, major events over the last 20 years has shifted people's understanding of foreign policy, geopolitics, etc. The Iraq War, for example, the financial crisis, the rise of China, these were events that were going to happen irrespective of the historical stuff. And when they happened, they fractured our understanding of foreign policy. They're fractured the idea of interconnectedness, of spreading democracy. And in so doing, the revenge of geopolitics is the hearkening back to the historical paradigm of nation states seeking their national interests, potential hegemonic pursuits, focusing on your people, quote unquote, against the other people. And rather than having the idea of rising tide raising all boats, no, it's I need to get mine, etc., all coming together. And then the two big trends that come along with this is you mentioned great power politics. That's absolutely one of them. Because we saw peer competitors to the United States and other countries rising. So China and Russia are relatively obvious, but the EU as a supranational peer competitor, Brazil, India, etc., attempting great power status to secure their own interests, both market and security. And in so doing, they challenged the sort of Washington consensus. And where this goes together is deglobalization. So the fracturing I talked about that allowed these long-term historical underpinnings to rise makes all the risks we talk about in this report deeply connected to each other, because you have the risks kind of under great power politics and deglobalization, but then they intermingle with each other as well. And so because it's the trends going together that we see this happening.
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting sort of paradox to me that deglobalization creates more interconnected risks. And so like I was trying to think about trying to kind of understand that myself of why we think that, and the best analogy I could come up with is because the system is not collapsing like a house of cards. It's not just a completely bursting wide open. It's this kind of unpicking of the knots of globalization where they were tied together. But seemingly what's happened is you like as you unpick one knot to disconnect, it creates kind of a knot somewhere else and an issue somewhere else. And that's the kind of thread now that I've been following in that. And then I think, when we talk about great power politics, I mean the obvious one causing the greatest issues at the moment are, the competition between US and China. So just from you, really, from what your perspective is, what does that mean for kind of like the year ahead and beyond, I suppose?
Yeah, so the US and China competition is central to our understanding of both deglobalization and great power politics,
Mm.
because we've realized that helping each other doesn't really secure our own interests. And that's the problem. And so corporations have particularly seen the impacts of this really post COVID. Post COVID, or COVID was a catalyst for us to recognize that essentially we're going to start decoupling. And as soon as we were competing with each other, this was most likely going to happen. This isn't new to history. We've seen this kind of great power competition and decoupling and separation in everything from the British and French empires, then the Napoleonic period, up through the 20th century. So this is nothing new, but we have to accept that it's happening. And so the US and China are going to try and balance against each other. That's naturally what great powers do when they're in competition. And that balancing is going to require, for example, cutting off certain resources. And so the West has attempted export bans on semiconductors, for example, that China desperately needs. So China is several years behind on advanced semiconductors because of this. They weren't able to develop their own domestic industry, and so they're struggling needing the kind of advanced ones. But it's also corporations pulling out of China because of the increased totalitarianism there and the arbitrariness, and then it's no longer cost effective, and then they may increasingly face sanctions. So people are pulling out their manufacturing or investment because it's not really worth it either. So we're seeing this decoupling in economic terms, but then also in more focused area, we're also seeing the balkanization of
Mm.
technology, in which, because of the kinds of export bans or investment changes, research not being done simultaneously together, we're seeing the US, the West, including Japan, um, develop their own technologies and internets, essentially. And China is now doing the same with its own. Operating systems and cell phones, for example, was an issue a couple of years ago, where China is focusing on a domestic version of theirs. And then you have the security aspect too of this as well. It's not just the corporations and not just the economic interests, but balkanization of tech refers to, say, like the splitting of the internet. And China's Great Firewall means that we're moving towards corporations and then governments generally and people generally having actual separate internets. And
Mm.
so we're seeing the great power competition with balancing and export bans impacting the deglobalization and the decoupling and the splitting of the internet and the balkanization of technology. And it's all interconnected. You can't separate out one of these without understanding the other ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen that, I suppose we refer to it as the balkanization of tech, with companies not releasing certain new products in certain markets because of regulatory issues. I think a couple of the major tech companies, I think it was maybe Apple and Facebook, didn't release some of their artificial intelligence models or products directly into the European market initially because there were some like barriers to kind of get past before they felt like they could do that successfully. So I feel like it extends, we talk about it a lot in terms of like China and the US, but it does extend it across kind of many markets.
Oh, definitely. And like this is why I mentioned like the EU as a supranational peer competitor, because no single European country could possibly come close as a peer competitor.
Mhm.
But together they actually have significant economic power
Yeah.
and regulatory power. And so we talked, this is just a minute ago, we talked about the US China great power competition. But the EU and the US don't always agree on a lot of things, despite being the West, quote
Yeah, yeah.
unquote. There's quite a bit of divergence between the various aspects. And I think this is another example of how even sort of intra blocks, and I mean that as sort of the economic or political bloc, can have disagreements as well. And that's where we're seeing this rendering of deglobalization impact further. So the EU has passed a number of data privacy laws and data security laws because of the EU's understanding of what the consumer's privacy should be. Okay, understandable. But you're now seeing a particular negative impact in that it over-regulated the market. And American technology companies aren't wanting to deal with these kinds of regulations that are essentially anti-innovation. And so they're pulling out as well. And so the EU, I think, is going to face a lot of different risks, in particular with deglobalization, because they don't necessarily want to turn to China either. Some countries have, some corporations have, but take again semiconductors, the Dutch government has been enforcing export bans. And so you're seeing the decoupling between Europe and China as well. And so this deglobalization, this balkanization is truly global. It's not like it's going to be, you know, in the Cold War where we have two competing blocks.
Yeah.
It's going to be multipolar. It's going to have
Yeah.
blocks all over the world.